the world economy cannot function if the Strait of Hormuz is closed for any significant time.
You're seeing countries have to shut in their production because they're running out of tankage to store oil.
Inside the Gulf is about 500,000 barrels of naphtha.
30% of the global market for naphtha comes out from the Gulf.
Gamboo is averaging about 730,000 barrels a day lifting, which is, let's call it about half of a VL every day. Since this started, there's been 9 VLs loaded, with 2 more loading as we speak.
Hello and welcome to The Energy Gang, a discussion show from Wood Mackenzie about the fast-changing world of energy. I'm Crooks, and on this show we're going to be talking about what everyone's talking about, the war with Iran, and in particular we're going to be talking about the Strait of Hormuz, that critical artery for global energy supplies, and we're going to be talking about what the disruption means for the world of energy. To do that, I'm joined by Amy Myers-Jaffe. Amy is the Director of the Energy, Climate Justice and Sustainability Lab at New York University. Hi Amy, how are you?
A little bit sleepless, but none the worse for wear.
I can imagine, yes. It's, a lot going on and a lot to talk about. To join that conversation, it's also a pleasure to welcome for the first time another colleague of mine at Wood Mackenzie, Chris Avasano. Chris is our Director of Maritime Partnerships. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Ed. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great to see you. Very glad you could join us. You've also got your own podcast, haven't you? Your own award-winning podcast I was just hearing. You're the host of The Last Dinosaur. That's a podcast about shipping.
Absolutely. Yeah, we talk a lot about digitalization and kind of how we're one of the oldest industries around and one of the last really to truly embrace digitalization.
Right. And you've got some fantastic insights to share on the shipping industry, I know, because it really seems to me that when we think about what does the war with Iran mean for the world of energy, it's that maritime issue, the shipping, that is absolutely crucial, that's right at the heart of it. So we're recording this in the afternoon of Monday, March the 9th. Just in the past 24 hours, we've had some really dramatic developments. When the Asian markets opened on Sunday night US time, oil prices absolutely soared, went to about $119 a barrel briefly for a while, since fallen right back again down below 100. Last time I looked, it was only about $92 a barrel. It was only about 4% up from where it was last week when the market closed on Friday. So a lot of turbulence there, not necessarily a clear direction. Natural gas prices are also up very significantly in Europe. Those prices are very much driven by the availability of LNG. With no LNG flowing out of the Gulf region, that's driving up the cost of gas in Europe. It's, last time I looked, about $18 per million British thermal units. That's still not quite at the absolutely stratospheric levels. It was up at the kind of $100 per MMBTU level back in 2022 in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But still, it's a very elevated level. It's about double what it was a couple of weeks ago. So, as I say, these very, very significant market impacts. And as I say, it is the disruption to traffic through the Strait of Hormuz that is very much causing that. Now, when I look at all this, given the time I have spent watching energy markets, it feels like the most predictable set of market reactions that there could be. This is not anything like a kind of black swan event. When people talked about risks to global energy supplies, one of the very first things that people always used to talk about is what would happen if the Strait of Hormuz was closed. I mean, this is something, Amy, which you've thought about for a very long time, right? I mean, this is, as I say, this is a risk that has been absolutely built into everyone's strategic planning, hasn't it?
So let me just say, not to date myself, but, 1990s, with another professor from Rice University where I was working at the time, we wrote a chapter in a book published by the U.S. Army War College on the Strait of Hormuz. And we had done some work on bypass pipelines, some of which have now been built, and strategies. And at the time, there was a lot of work done then and since, where people concluded that it would be very hard to close the Strait of Hormuz for more than a few days. And there was a lot of work done by different scholars about speedboats and other different kinds of mechanisms. But the experience was that the U.S. Navy could do some kind of an escort process, and it would be very hard to have a lengthy shutdown of the straits. And, one of the big issues, if the Iranians had a nuclear weapon and they made a nuclear declaration, said no one's coming through the straits, would that be a bigger problem? That was something that people gamed out. But I think the problem is, and this goes to the market's sudden reaction, like the market didn't have the same crazy reaction in the first couple of days, and then all of a sudden you saw it really take off. And that's because there's a newer understanding of what these unconventional ways of doing attacks means, whether that's drones or drone boats, or all these different sort of digital, one person with a truck and some kind of a machine that could be automated. The technology is so advanced now, just in the last couple of years, that I think the market started to realize that, not your father's Oldsmobile when it comes to how you close the Strait of Hormuz. And therefore, people are still in the process of adjusting. And, the White House and the U.S. government is starting to try to assure people that they understand the scope of the problem. They understand the terrorism part of the problem as opposed to, naval part of the problem. And so I do think that it's not, I think there was a little moment in time when maybe the market was afraid that people didn't get it. And so that's not accurate. But shutting down these more small device elements is harder than the things that people studied in the 1990s and 2000s.
Yeah, so I really want to get into that question of the history of escorting tankers through the Gulf and what that can teach us about the present. I want to get onto that later. Just before we do, just a couple of facts about the basics of the Strait of Hormuz. It's what I think about 21, 22 miles across. So that's not much at its narrowest point. And it's even narrower, I think, for the shipping lanes. The shipping lanes that tankers can get through are only about 2 miles wide. I think there are 2 of those. So that does pretty obviously create very significant vulnerability, doesn't it, in terms of exposing shipping to attack. Is that right, Amy?
The question really is, what can be done from the shoreline? And what kind of equipment do you need? Are we, in the old days, people worried about missiles. Are they placing missiles along the shoreline on the Iranian side or in these islands that could be disruptive? Whereas in today's world, any individual with a drone can be a nuisance. And so I think it's really a different calculation today. And the geography of the width, I think, is less important in the sense that these drones and other kinds of machinery, have a pretty wide swath when you think about where they're going, and the missiles, like how far they can go from the Iranian coastline. So, it's different days today. But I think it's good for the listeners to understand that we're not talking about a tiny passageway where only one ship can go out at a time. We're talking about a couple of miles, but we're also talking about well within the range of unconventional asymmetric weaponry.
Right, got it. And also then the other crucial basic fact about the Strait of Hormuz is it is crucial to the world economy because about 15% of the world's crude oil flows through it, produced in the Gulf and exported to markets around the world. About 20% of the world's LNG came from there. And for some critical chemicals, it's even higher than that. For urea, I've seen different numbers flying around, but maybe 35%, 45%. So this is absolutely critical material for fertiliser. Fertiliser prices already rocketing. People are saying that could be the cause of real problems in the global agriculture industry and for food supply. Sulfur, which is also important for fertilizer, it could be 45 or 50% of all the world's supply of that goes through the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. So what you will sometimes hear people say is the world economy cannot function if the Strait of Hormuz is closed for any significant time. And that seems right to me. If the strait does stay closed for months and years, obviously eventually the world can adjust, but it would mean a very serious global recession as we adjust to those reduced commodity flows, wouldn't it?
And I think one of the things that's been surprising but not surprising is that the oil market was super oversupplied at the moment that we went into this process. The Saudis had some oil, as they often do, outside the Strait of Hormuz. UAE had oil, down at Fujairah, right? And they have the alternative pipelines, which we'll go into. But so that's why I kind of focus on this sort of terrorism part. I call it terrorism, even though it's a full-scale war, because for the market to recalibrate itself, it has to believe that this unconventional attacks could be shut down in some form or fashion, that we could kind of not be completely back to normal, but kind of back to normal. And I think that trading companies and buyers and so forth are just having trouble picturing how are we going to get back to that state of affairs. And that's been the challenge in terms of communications from the U.S. government and from G7 countries, giving people the confidence to know that we know it's been a week, but we're on top of it. That confidence level has not come into the market yet. And that's why we see, what we've seen. And today, oil prices came down a little bit because there was this acknowledgement that the G7 need to look at strategic stocks. But that's also an acknowledgement that we're not just whipping the tankers through the Strait of Hormuz any day soon.
Yeah, when you talk about the IEA, talk about strategic stocks, you mean releasing oil from the inventories that countries are meant to hold as part of their membership of the IEA.
In case of emergency, right?
So in case of an emergency, just like this one, in fact, yeah.
Right, and one of the reasons why the IEA stocks are important is because member countries are affected differentially, right? So maybe the inventory position or the refining crude oil feedstock position is different for certain countries in Asia than it is, for the United States or Canada, right? So, having a coordinated strategic response, puts the market mind at ease. You don't get, it alleviates this idea that people have to do panic buying.
Right, yeah, got it. So in terms of what's going on right now then, Chris, what do we know? People sometimes talk about the Strait of Hormuz being closed, and I've even done that myself earlier in the show. It's not completely closed, is it? There is a little bit of traffic, but really not much.
And then, Chris, also, tell us about the human side, because the human side is quite dramatic and unfortunate.
Yeah, I think we'll start there, and because I've being an ex-seafarer, and I'll say I didn't do it for as long as many other people. I only did it for about 3.5, 4 years at sea, not including my time at school. But you kind of have this thought. I remember, I'll go back to a little story a long time ago, when you're on the East Coast, which is where I think we all are of the U.S., and you say, oh, that storm went out to sea. Well, that's where I was. I remember my mother saying to me, well, that's where you are. I don't like it when storms go out to sea, because you forget about it, right? And I think that the estimates are around 20,000 seafarers, plus another 15,000 people or so stuck on cruise ships and ferries and all these other sort of things. So you're talking about a lot of people stuck in this war zone. But up until this time, as we're recording here on Monday afternoon, there were 7 casualties, merchant mariners casualties. These are seafarers who are making money, a lot of times sending it back home, the Philippines, Bangladesh, Eastern Europe. Some of the officers may be a lot of Indian officers, Western European, from all over the world. And they're just making money and sending it back home. And now they're getting shot. So it's kind of insane. So as we go through this, I always like to reflect upon the hard work that they're doing, and, to think about what they've done.
And the risk that they're taking. I mean, people know that they're taking some risk going to the Middle East in the last year, but I don't think that people imagined, that, to my point about unconventional warfare, I do not think that people imagined that they were going to get stuck inside the war zone
No.
for 10 or 20 or 30 days.
No.
I mean, it's one thing to take the risk of being shot at. We saw that with the Houthi conflict, down south. But so people understand that, and they understand that, but that's really different when you're sailing.
Right.
Than to be literally stuck in the war zone. And you think about just the human experience of you're on this ship.
Yeah.
And, I think of the term sitting duck, like you're on this ship and it's just a crapshoot, whether you're hit or not.
And it's loaded with petroleum or even just your bunker tank. I mean, it is an unnerving experience for sure. And one, like you said, it's the human element part that, just everybody needs to consider as we're talking about numbers, and we see X number of ships and Y number of ships, and this one snuck through at night and all this other stuff. There's a lot of risk because, with the 25 or so people, give or take, those are 25 people sending money back home and just trying to live, trying to do better for themselves and their families at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, that is a great point. And as you say, it's really important for everyone to remember that. As you say, again, these are civilians. These are not people who are combatants in any sense, but they have been dragged into this war.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But looking at the numbers, I think getting into the numbers, I think, before, using the Wood Mackenzie vessel tracker platform, we kind of estimated between 150 and 175 ships per day leading up to this. We did a quick analysis, and then you just saw the graph go straight down, kind of the opposite of what you're seeing with crude oil prices, where it's going straight up. You just flip the graph upside down, and that's kind of what your Hormuz traffic looks like. And as of this morning, we ran some numbers, and I think we had about 5 or 6 known ships with their AIS signal on. And then obviously we're getting other ships that are going through where they shut it off leading into the Hormuz and then turn it back on someplace safely off the coast. Reports of about 6 or so oil tankers since this started. And then another 5, I think, of Iranian boats going through as well. So if you think about that, we're 10 days in. We've had 11 ships so far, plus a smattering of bulk carriers, my understanding, where they're doing what they've done in the Red Sea, which is where they'll put on their AIS signal Chinese-owned Chinese bulkers to kind of signal to the Iranians, we're not Western, we're Chinese. And they've done that in the Red Sea, and apparently they're doing it now in the Straits of Hormuz. But again, whatever we're seeing go through are generally smaller and generally kind of general cargo, small ships just trying to get out, maybe just that are more for local type shipping.
Right. So just to clarify those numbers then, you're saying, again, in normal times, pre-war, you'd have had about 150 to 175 ships going through the Strait of Hormuz.
Correct.
Every day.
Correct.
And now you're saying what we've had maybe 10 in total, and this is counting the ships that have gone dark and everything.
We've had about 8 to 10 a day going through.
Okay.
Plus another 10 or so of the bigger tankers where they kind of go dark, which is, so then you're really ramping it up to about 11, maybe 12 a day, give or take. That's it.
Got it. And to be clear about what that going dark means then, so the AIS, this is automatic identification system beacons, right? So this is what every ship has that tells everyone where it is. And this is one of the crucial things that ship tracking services like ours use to find where they are.
Yeah, and it also provides data with their radar, and I believe it could identify your call sign and the ship and things like that. So it's also an aid to navigation. It's a safety issue. So when you shut that off, you still can see the ping. In other words, you can still see the radar imagery. You just don't have the associated data with it. I'm dating myself. When I was sailing, we didn't have this. So I'm describing on how it was described to me. But think of it like when you see airlines in the black box. It's the same, not really a black box, but when you see the airlines and it has the flight number and it's the same idea for that. And yes, we do have that service, but you could also see on the ship. So when you go dark, you kind of lose that ability to know what the other ship is exactly out there.
Right. And you're saying you can spoof it as well, that if you're, not a Chinese vessel, you can say, hey, we are actually Chinese.
No, it's actually, apparently the Chinese vessels are doing this, but yes, there is also a lot of spoofing, which is going to make keeping track of who's in and who's out a lot more difficult. And this is something that we've already started to see. Spoofing incidences have gone up. And just even keeping track, because what happens is they start to spoof themselves in clusters. It makes the counting of these numbers a lot more difficult. And we're seeing that already, actually.
And so in terms of, as you say, the big tankers, which are the ones that really matter for global energy, you're saying maybe one or two a day, of oil or of these LNG tankers, or these are what is moving and where's it going, do you think?
It's the crude oil tankers, so the bigger, the crude oil ships. I haven't heard of seen anything on the LNG side. And just to give you a reference of what's stuck, we did some analysis. We count about 25 or so product tankers. In other words, some of the products, refined products, Amy, to your point, where they have the double-edged sword of the crude oil coming out and the refined product.
And that would be things like gasoline or diesel or jet fuel. Yeah.
Well, I think the big thing is, jet fuel, you're talking about 1.1 million barrels a day of supply that normally comes out through Strait of Hormuz. So that's 17, 19% of the market for jet fuel.
Yeah, and we have what we're counting right now is a total of about 25 ships, about 1.8 million tons. The big chunk that's sitting in, inside the Gulf is about 500,000 barrels of naphtha, actually, that we have. To your point, we count about 419,000 metric tons of jet fuel that's sitting on this side on the inside of the AG right now. That's what we're counting.
And I've seen, like, Ed, if you look at the charts that people are putting out about what percentage of the global market for different products are being held up, naphtha is at the top of the list.
Yeah.
Right there, it's something like 30% of the global market for naphtha comes out from the Gulf.
Which is typically used as a petrochemical feedstock? Is that something for the petrochemicals industry you'd say you'd use naphtha for? Or for refining, right?
It mostly affects the petrochemical industry. I think the thing that is sort of at least a little bit helpful is that in other parts of the world, like the United States, as I was saying, petrochemicals were kind of in the doldrums. And so there is supply that can be, you have production that can be increased in the United States and other locations that can make up for some of that. But for individual businesses or individual suppliers, losing that much naphtha is a big loss.
And just to give you something, because this sort of came up in another context, which we could talk about, Ed, in a few minutes, and that is to go from let's just say Fujairah or any center point in the Gulf to Singapore is about 10 or 11 days, give or take. To go from the U.S. Gulf is about 33, 34 days. So that 21-day delta, right, of that you can't get supply, basically, right? Because right now you're on the train of, it's a 10-day voyage from load, or let's say a 3+ week round trip if you were just on the same ship doing it over and over. And now all of a sudden that becomes different. So what that does for the shipping market is create a lot of inefficiency, which is driving freight rates up as well. I've read people talk about freight rates being more paper rates because nobody's actually done the voyages. It's just what's being bid right now. But certainly it's going to have that impact.
Right. And Chris, to your point, people don't even know whether to do it. Is the strait going to stay closed for 20 days, in which case they should do it, and the U.S. petrochemical industry should gear up?
Right.
Or are we going to reopen in 3 days, in which case that would look like a dumb expense?
Right. And then you're going to have an oversupply in, let's just call it Singapore, or a tank terminal in Asia, for example.
Right. So it's I think as a business proposition, I think it's a very difficult decision tree about what to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. For as long as there is uncertainty, people have an incentive not to commit to things. There is inefficiency, friction being introduced into the system, delays. that pushes the cost of everything up. In time, we could adjust, but takes a long time potentially. And as you say, at the moment, Amy, we don't know whether to adjust or not because we don't know how long this is going to go on for.
To that point, Ed, part of the problem with the Russia-Ukraine conflict when it began and we got to early 2022, the market did eventually adjust, and it turned out there wasn't really that big a supply change. It was just reasserting like who's supplying whom. In this case, it's much more complicated because of the uncertainty. It's not clear. When the war started in Ukraine, nobody thought that was going to be a fast thing. In this case, people are trying to reassess. Are we talking about a long duration conflict? I mean, the Russian conflict, we're 2026 and it's still raging on. So, trying to think through what the consequences could be and what parties can last and who can't last. And, you're just seeing a lot of speculation about that. But we're already 10 days in and the strait is still effectively shut down.
Yeah, indeed. So just going back, Chris, to what you were talking about in terms of maybe one or two tankers a day going through with the beacons off and kind of slipping through, having gone dark. Are these the very largest tankers? So what a kind of a huge VLCC carries maybe 2 million barrels of oil?
VLs is generally two. And if I remember correctly from my numbers, it was 2 VLs, 3 Suezmaxes, which is 1 million barrels, and then a Panamax. So that's 4 million plus 7 million barrels plus a Panamax, which is about 350,000 barrels as well. That's on the sanctioned compliance ships. And then there's some other tonnage. That's the Iranian ships. I don't have any guidance on VLs or Suezmaxes. That's generally what they have that have gone through.
Right. But anyway, that is an absolute trickle then compared to that 15 million barrels a day that was moving before the war.
Correct. Yeah. And so let's just say we're 10 days out. You're talking maybe 1 million, maybe probably less than that, actually, because they're not all VLs. So, maybe 1.5 million or something like that. It's not what it was. And some of it, could already well be spoken for. So it's kind of built into the system, not what's coming down the line.
Well, and I think what's scaring the market is really that you're already seeing countries, Iraq specifically, but now increasingly people are talking about the same thing with Kuwait, is you're seeing countries have to shut in their production because they're running out of tankage to store oil. That worries the market in different ways because now I'm worrying about, well, how long would it be down and what would be the process to bring it back online, and is there going to be some kind of delay with that? And then, you have the example of what happened with Qatar with LNG, where they announced force majeure. They said they're going to be down for some much more lengthy period of time. Not we're talking about maybe a month or 2 or 3, not a week or 2 or more. And Chris, you can help the listeners understand what that means, because these kind of facilities, it's not like your light switch where you're switching it on and off, and same thing for the tankers. And so the longer it goes on, the longer it takes to bring it back online. Maybe you can help the listeners understand that in terms of the shipping side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a real concern, especially when it comes down to the LNG carriers. So when you refer to tankers, you're generally referring to the oil tankers. So whether that's clean petroleum products, like we talked about naphtha and other things, or VLCCs, which is generally crude, Suezmax is generally crude. Those are a little bit fundamentally simpler. Again, not easy, but just fundamentally simpler. And kind of the time between those cargoes, there's not that much to do beforehand, right? Unless you're sitting for a year or 2, then it becomes a different story. But let's say even if you're waiting for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, there's not a ton to do as long as you maintain the ship, and you could do a bunch of things internally. It becomes interesting when you talk about LNG carriers, and really there's a handful of different, let's call it layups or different layups that they use. The first one is called a hot layup. And when we talked about this earlier, Ed, it was funny. You kind of said hot should be cold and cold should be hot. And I get that. We'll explain why in a second.
Because it's cryogenic.
Because the gas is being carried at very low temperature.
So for a hot layup, the engines and systems are live and tested every couple of days. But you could keep about 40% of your crew. You're at anchor, and you could reactivate about 1 to 3 days. And I haven't heard of anybody being in any of these statuses yet for this reason. Warm layup is like your next level, and that's power sources and systems are stripped back to essential. You have about 5 people. You're still at anchor. Reactivation now, you talk about 1 to 2 weeks ahead, right? Because you got to bring people back in. You have to start to warm up the tanks or cool down the tanks, excuse me. And then the last one is called cold layup, which is where the power systems are off. You have no electricity coming in. You're at anchor or linked to shoreside power. It's about a month to reactivate, and some estimates are between $1 to $2 million to reactivate. And that's to get, your tanks warm, cooled down. I think all these have a varying capacity of not keeping the tanks absolutely cold, but in this case, you're starting from scratch, and that's the most expensive and lengthy one for sure.
Right. And so what you're saying is that of these LNG carriers, we don't know which ones might have been put in these various different kinds of layout. But that's going to be an important thing to watch, presumably, when we're trying to get an indication of how long is this going to go on, how long is this expected to go on, and in what forms they're going to take. You keep an eye on what people do with their carriers.
Right. And I think what we're actually seeing a little bit, putting aside what's coming out of Qatar, is we're seeing now ships that were bound, let's say, to go to Europe from the U.S., but now are turning around and going to the Far East to start to replace these cargoes here. So we're going to start seeing more and more of this. Right now, it seems to be anecdotal, but I'm sure in the next couple of days we'll get numbers about the ships that are doing that very thing.
So let's talk a few statistics. 45% in recent years of the LNG that was signed up into contracts, worldwide, went to what we call portfolio players. So that's companies like the Shells and BPs that, sometimes remarket the barrels, basically, and sell them to different markets, right? The interesting thing is the expectations were that 2026, we were going to have a 10 or 13 BCM surplus of LNG. Right now, we're talking about Qatar's portfolio, which before they were starting up the additional expansion of the dome, North Dome, which is their only, Ras Laffan, which was been disrupted by the war, their export portfolio was 170 to 179 BCM. So, and if you think about, how many months disruption are we talking about? I mean, a 3-month disruption is going to go way beyond this 10 or 13 BCM surplus that people were expecting in the market. And then you're going to add on top of that the fact that there were customers that were expecting to get new contracted volumes from Qatar later in the year. So it's really, on the LNG side, a very big disruption. And ironically, it's a disruption that's coming into a market where a giant surplus was expected to emerge. And now, at least temporarily, we're in a very different situation.
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic point. And definitely something I want to get onto in a moment is a discussion of the sort of wider impacts of this disruption on the global energy system. Before we do that, though, Chris, I wanted to go back to you about something, which is the question of, given this traffic has slowed to a trickle, as we've been saying, why is that? You hear a lot of people talk about insurance as being an issue, and this is something then which the US has moved to address. On Friday, we had the US government announcing this $20 billion facility backed by the Development Finance Corporation, essentially insuring ships and their cargoes for moving through the Gulf. with the idea that this would then fix that problem of insurance and make it possible for more shipping to move. How big of an issue is that really? Is it insurance that's been stopping ships moving? And if so, will this new US facility actually help them to get going?
So I don't know the second part to your question, will it get going? Again, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in that insurance market, right? Because there's kind of, and maybe you can keep this in, maybe you can't, but there's, in generally, I understand to be three big buckets of insurance, okay? There's your cargo insurance, which is the cargo, just the cargo itself. There's what they call the hull and machinery, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the ship itself. And then there's something called protection and indemnity. That's if you have a slip and fall, or that's if you have a cargo spill and then you pollute everything. Who's responsible for all that, right? And you have spill insurance, you have all these other things. So there's all these different buckets of insurance. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what, if anything, the U.S. government will cover on these sort of things. Okay, we could pay for your ship, but we're not going to pay for the oil spill.
Yeah, that's, as I understand it, that's exactly what they've said, that they've said we'll cover hull and machinery and the cargo, but only those two things. Yeah, but not liability.
Right. And if you let's take the aforementioned VLCCs, the price of those are 120, 150 million brand new at $90 a barrel for 2 million barrels. It's $180 million. So 180 plus, let's call it 120 for easy math because I'm a ship guy, is $300 million. Fine. But what about the spill resulting in that accident that now messed up somebody's desalination unit, which we haven't talked about yet, and you've polluted everything in a 30-mile radius? Who's responsible for that? So where does this fund take care of it? And I think that's part of some of the questions. I haven't heard of anybody on the insurance side, what they're doing yet. I know that the insurance cover, I think, stopped on the 5th because you have to give notice. You just can't pull cover. I think it stopped on the 5th. So now today's the 9th. I haven't really heard any sort of changes. It sounds like the cost of cover has gone up exponentially to make a transit. But honestly, I think I read somewhere it's about like $1 million or something, depending on the size of the ship. But if you're talking about all these shut-ins and other things, would people want to do it? Well, yeah, they'll pay it. But then it becomes, do you get the crews on board? It goes back to these sort of things. There are some ship owners who would be willing to pay their crew more and send them through, and that's been well documented. There are other ship owners who will not do that until they have more assurances in terms of safety, not necessarily in terms of liability protection. And I think that, for some of those owners, the reason why is because their seafarers live in their communities. I'm thinking of Italian and some Greek ship owners. So it's this balance, right? It's a huge balance that they're playing right now. And I haven't really heard much about, will people start to move the needle in terms of insurance and, want to go through. Amy, it comes back to your point. It's a massive amount of uncertainty.
Right. And so then the question is, what can the US do to resolve that uncertainty by presumably using military action to ensure that the passage of those tankers and other shipping is safe? I mean, I think back to the tanker war of the 1980s as a possible parallel there, right? When during the Iran-Iraq war, the US Navy deployed to the Gulf. It was the largest deployment of the US Navy at that time since World War II. And that actually seems to have been quite effective, wasn't it? That the Navy did manage, they had some missteps, there were some issues, but they did manage to get tanker traffic through. Is it plausible they could do something like that again, Amy, do you think? Is that what we're heading for?
I mean, we're definitely heading for that. And just to remind people, not only did we have this military escort of the tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, but we had these wonderful minesweeper ships that went through and got rid of the mines because the Iranians had mined the Gulf. And so it wasn't even just that you had to worry about being shot at from your tanker. You had to worry that it would hit a sea-floating mine. I think, again, not to harp on, how the technology has changed, Absolutely. We're looking at different kind of plans for escorts. You have some NATO countries sending shipping down. The intention is to have those European militaries also escort ships through the straits. So I think sort of an escort plan is definitely in the works. But then I think there's this question, and we've already activated again, which Ed, we can go down that rabbit hole in a minute. We've already activated pipeline bypass routes for some of the countries, and of course, a lot of the countries, whether you're talking about Saudi Arabia or Abu Dhabi and Kuwait, they own their own tankers, so it's not one of these ship broker, can I get someone to commit a tanker thing. They have their own tankers. So, they're making their own logistical choices about how to go to these bypass routes and what that's going to look like. But still in all, the question is going forward, how does the United States convey to the market that they are taking actions to shut down these other kinds of risks, whether that's for the safety of the seafarers or whether that's because of this, protection and indemnity, which, everyone in the Gulf always 24/7, even in peacetime, worries about a spill, especially because of desalination, but also because of the ecology of the Gulf and tourism. And, there's just so many different reasons why the Gulf countries are, unified in trying to protect that waterway. So, how do we get to the point where some of the uncertainty is lifted? So, you're never going to get to the point where you can 100% say there's never going to be, someone with a thing on their shoulder. But, what about sort of really going for a number of days? Like, can we get to the point where we go for a number of days where it's quiet and people say, oh, look, we're gaining on it, I'm going to move my ship?
Yeah, so this is what I really wonder about, and this is what I wonder about, Chris, with reference to the Red Sea that you mentioned earlier, which is, it is clear that the US and Israel have massively degraded Iran's military capabilities. And if you look at the numbers of missiles and drones that have been launched, those have come right down. It is not clear that Iran's ability to hit shipping in the Gulf has been wiped out. And that I don't have a good feel for at all. But I think when you look at what happened in the Red Sea, where the Houthis operating obviously on very limited resources and with strikes against them in order to try and suppress them and stop them attacking shipping, they were able to carry on that campaign and stop some ships going through the Red Sea for a protracted period, weren't they? What's your sense of this?
Well, I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier, and that was the supply chain just kind of absorbed the shock, right? And that was really more of a container ship issue, which we haven't really talked about. Obviously, consumer goods.
Yeah, sorry, just jump in, but to be clear, what the shock was. So container ships, stopped moving through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea? Or?
Container ships were going generally going from Asia to the Mediterranean and then onto Northern Europe.
And has that traffic been restored then?
No,
or not yet?
No, there was
okay,
actually
so still not to this day. Okay.
There was some talks about those ships at the end of the year in 2025. You started to hear chatter in the market about ships looking into going back through the Red Sea. And then this happened and nope, we're just going to keep going around Africa and go servicing the markets that way. But really it was a shock of the ships getting to the Horn of Africa and saying, we're not going through there, but we have an alternative. And going around, and if I remember correctly, it was an extra 20 to 24 days, depending on where you were going. So yes, you would have a supply shock for those 24 days, but then as the ships started to route, as you adjusted your inventories, you were able to, for a lack of a better term, figure it out. I think we're seeing a very little bit of this right now, And talking about, Amy, you mentioned earlier some of the alternative pipelines which came into effect. Obviously, the East-West pipeline going from the Gulf side of Saudi Arabia into Yanbu has basically gone a little bonkers. For example, we have some analysis that we've done internally on with our Maritime group. Yanbu was averaging about 730,000 barrels a day lifting, which is, let's call it about half of a VL every day. So 1 VL every 2 days. Since this started, there's been 9 VLs loaded, with 2 more loading as we speak, pushing up to somewhere around 2.5 million barrels a day. So it's completely changed. All of those, except for one, have gone north into the Ain Sukna pipeline. Again, another alternative pipeline. So all of those have gone north, and eventually they'll either continue north via the canal or go into the pipeline, and then end up in City Career, but generally servicing the European markets. One ship was slated to go to Malaysia.
Right, that's fascinating. So then, because I was about to say, well, is the Red Sea not really safe for tankers either? So they don't want to be coming down out of the Red Sea.
Would they stay north? Now, again, so far, 8 of the 9 that have been fully loaded as of this morning are indicating north. And it sounds like either they'll just drop everything off at Ain Sukna and come back, or they'll drop cargo just to get in and then go through the canal. I believe 1 or 2 ships are actually just shuttling. They're just going to drop it off at the pipeline and then go back to Yanbu. So there is that happening. Again, going through the Red Sea, through that choke point where the Houthis controlled it, if it's a ship going to Malaysia, they could maybe send up the same sort of AIS signal that says, "We're Chinese, we have nothing to do with this, please don't hit us, sir," and, go full steam ahead. I'm not sure what will happen with that ship, but that's what's happening right now. And again, it's a limited thing, but you are seeing that diversion of cargoes.
Right, just to check the places we've been talking about then. So Yanbu is the place on the west coast of Saudi Arabia where the pipeline ends and the tankers pick up the oil, and then they, as you say, sail north up the Red Sea to Ain Sukna?
Ain Sukna, which is on the Red Sea side. Yep.
And that's in Egypt, is it?
In Egypt.
Right, okay.
And then there's a pipeline that goes from Ain Sukna to City Career, which is in the Mediterranean.
Right.
And you could pick up there. A lot of the VLCCs, the big ships, can't go in the Suez Canal fully laden. So they have to drop off part of their cargo and they either pick it up or a smaller ship will pick it up and the bigger ship goes on its way. I remember trading when I was a broker. We used to do tons of cargo at a City Career, and you would go to places that the big VLCCs can't go. For example, Augusta in Sicily.
So the interesting thing is that the pipeline that the Saudis have can do a lot more volume than 2.5 million barrels a day. They can get, 6-7 million barrels a day, especially if they use drag reduction agents to enhance the flow rate.
Again, just a footnote. What is a drag reduction agent? So that's a chemical you put in the pipeline, right? What is that?
Right, and it makes the oil flow faster, so you can get more to flow through with the same number of pumping stations. They use that in Colombia and places where the pipeline would get blown up, and then they'd put in DRAs, to make up the volume that was lost. You have a pipeline coming from the United Arab Emirates. So the question is going to be, again, like, how important do those pipelines become? Do they go to full capacity? Do they go beyond full capacity? Who's going to buy the oil that way? How desperate are people to get that oil? As Chris is saying, is it how fast and efficient can we be? Going through Ain Sukna and then picking it up again in the Med. So I think it was designed to solve this exact problem. So it'd be interesting to see how it turns out operationally the longer things drag on.
Right. But I want to be absolutely clear about this then. So as you say, there is extra logistical difficulty involved. There is friction. There is increased cost. But this is a partial solution But it's very important to remember it is only a partial solution. This cannot replace the ability to get cargoes out in tankers through the Strait of Hormuz itself, right? I mean, it can mitigate the impact, not wipe it out. Or am I wrong? Go on.
Well, let's be specific, okay? Doesn't help Iraq, doesn't help Kuwait, right? There was a time when people talked about building a little spur from Kuwait to the Saudi pipeline. Doesn't the UAE pipeline's capacity is smaller than its export rate. I think for the Saudis, it won't be barrel for barrel, but if they had, Aramco is an extremely capable organization. I mean, you saw how fast they managed the problem when the Abqaiq processing unit got bombed in 2019. They repaired it in a miraculous way. They used inventories to keep the market whole in miraculous ways. So I would have confidence in them if they needed to use this Yanbu line in a very effective manner. And one would imagine they got the spare parts and whatever it is they need if that pipeline got hit by a drone, right? I would imagine that they're like in a pretty good shape in terms of really getting them as much oil as possible out that way if it turned out to be a long-term thing.
And then the other piece is it's not going to help the other products, right? So the refined products, not a question. And then the $1 million question or the $1 billion question is LNG, right? It's not an LNG pipeline. This is strictly crude oil. Looking at it from the macro view of the market, we can get some crude oil out that'll, like you said, Amy, mitigate some of the headaches, not get rid of it. And the ships are there to do it, and they could do what they can.
Like many things, and Chris, I'd love your opinion on this. Money's money. At some point, if the price of oil was really high, people are going to take the risk on the tanker. Some trading company, I won't name names, is going to say to themselves, we'll find this number of seafarers that are willing to go through the straits. We're going to pay for the tanker. We're going to make so much money getting this oil through. We're going to take that risk. I mean, if we really came to it, I think, again, I won't name names. We can all imagine the trading companies that might take on that risk in a long-term way.
Yeah, and I think there's mechanisms for seafarers to, try to double
war pay,
double their salaries, and is there some sort of thing in the charter party clause, like you're going to indemnify the owner of any spill? I mean, there are all sorts of ways that people can work on charter parties and come to agreements between the cargo owner and the ship owner. And even with, just be a little bit careful, even with some of the ships that are controlled long-term, by, let's say, an entity, there's still an obligation with the ship owner when it comes to things like this. It's not like a carte blanche, right?
Understood.
Unless
100%.
Even when you're building your own ship and you work for that company, there still is the unions and the representation of the seafarers. But in general, you should be able. I would imagine at some point you may see somebody waiving a lot of money.
Right, especially if we're having convoys and NATO's involved and so forth.
Okay, so put you both on the spot. How likely is it that we will see normal or near normal flows of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz in a month or 2 months or 3 months? Is it likely that we will see the flows of trade coming back again? 15 million barrels a day of oil, 20% of the world's LNG within a few weeks. $64,000 question. I was going to say,
I'm looking at Chris.
You're looking at each other to answer this one.
Expert, not some ex-ship guy.
No, I'm just tell us from a shipping point of view, because Chris, you make a good point, which is not just am I willing to put my physical ship at risk, or do I trust some military escort? It has to do also with the seafarers.
Yeah, I mean, right now there's so much up in the air, and we see things are changing moment by moment. I don't know if you guys have this same sort of thing, but a little bit of social media anxiety when you wake up in the morning and you check your news feed. And I think that that's not just indicative of me as a person, but, an industry person, right? So forwarding this to the human element of a seafarer, boy, a couple of months. I mean, if I'm a seafarer and I see gray holes around me, okay, I feel a little bit better, whether they're American or Dutch or French or whoever, right? Indonesian, I know they were involved when we had the piracy. I think there was some Indonesian Navy that was involved when we had piracies off the Horn of Africa 10, 15 years ago. So do you get a coalition of Navy running in and out with kind of these kind of littoral combat size ships? You don't need a battleship. Maybe I feel a little bit better, if I'm on a dry bulk ship with aluminum or something, or something for a smelter. I feel okay about that. Again, LNG, different story, but I feel we're so far away because the sides just don't feel like they will feel like talking to each other right now. And if I'm a seafarer, I'm very concerned about running through right now. Again, you've had a couple of reports of ships doing it with the AIS turned off. Maybe the price was right, or maybe they had an agreement with the owner. That's one thing, but wholesale, I feel like we're a little further away than what you think.
Amy, what do you think?
So what I would say is that there's definitely a military effort, not only to think about how an escort system would work, but also to think about units whose job it is to shut down asymmetric warfare. So I think that in the early days, fog of war, you don't see that progress being made. Maybe as time goes on, you're going to see more and more progress in that regard. And so I think the question, that's why I say this thing, like how much money does have to be at risk before you start to see people take a different attitude. I think it's really like, how low can we get the level of risk? And how high does the penalty of not sailing become? Because it's not just about, we're doing this podcast and a lot of people are listening to this podcast and they're sitting in the United States or they're sitting in Europe and we're talking about oil prices. But for the countries in the Gulf, not only is there this horrific human element of, air raid sirens and the kind of things that, come about at a time of war, there's also just the fundamentals, how much of your economy and your budget is tied to getting these products out to market and getting that revenue in. And so I think that decision makers are going to have this many different things to weigh in terms of the decision making. That's why I think that the pipelines make sense. I think that worrying about civilian targets and worrying about upstream targets, by upstream targets, I mean my critical infrastructure, as opposed to ships or berths or some of these things that are kind of maybe easier to repair.
Yeah, so that's things like oil fields, gas fields, processing plants, pipelines on land, all of that.
Pipelines actually are pretty easy to repair. Okay. I mean, our experience with war has been pipelines are easy to repair. But, everybody has to sit and think about their strategies. There's so many things to think about. Can you launch a drone without a truck, right? So, for example, when you look at, because there's a lot of criticism about whether or not, should they have picked bombing fuel depots or this or that. Like, it's hard to launch a drone without the truck platform. And if you don't have fuel for the trucks, then, guess what? Right? So there's many different ways to approach some of this risk. And those of us who are watching from a distance and you just wake up in the morning and you immediately go to social media to see if anything got blown up, like that's strainful. But there are people who are really skilled, working on the problem at many different levels, thinking strategically how to shut it down. So I like to give them credit and hope that, Ed, we're not having a podcast at the same level of intensity in 3 months than they are now for the next couple of days. But, it's complicated.
Well, no, I think the other piece too is we're talking about getting products and goods on a ship out of the Gulf, but there's a lot of products and goods that aren't coming into the Gulf, particularly food and other things. Going back again, outside of the normal field of kind of this discussion, but talking about container ships, MSC, the Mediterranean Shipping Company, just declared end of voyage at the end of last week for their ships, for their container ships. What does that mean? Well, if you have a container that is, let's say, in the in the Pacific Ocean or in the Indian Ocean heading for a Gulf state, they basically said, nope, we're going to drop the container off at the nearest port. We're going to, I think, have a surcharge of $800 for dropping it off early. And that's it. We're done. We're not going to take accountability for this cargo. So I think we've been looking at this problem from an outbound cargo point of view of getting exports out, but they need to get some imports in, in order to sustain. So I think that's could be another point of pressure. Does food run out? Do supply, then you talk about medical supplies, you talk about food, you talk about all these other things, not just for the Gulf state residents, but then ships run out of food too, right? Like, so then, the crews, so that could be another pressure point of, hey, we don't have stores. Like, we've run out of fresh milk, or we've run out of meat, or we've run out of, usually ships are good for a few weeks, right? But after a while, so I think there's going to be a multiple pressure points here.
Yeah, that's a great point. So look, as a final thought, I just want to ask about what this is going to mean for the future of energy, perhaps in the short term and the longer term. As I was saying earlier, this is, in a sense, a very predictable crisis. It was predicted and discussed for decades before it eventually hit. Do you think that the world of energy is going to be very different as a result of it?
So this is my feeling. This is where I think, Ed, you might not agree with me. Okay, so anytime that started in 2022. I'm India, I'm Pakistan, I'm countries in Asia, and I suddenly realized that LNG was not this reliable commodity that I thought it was. That the prices are crazy volatile, it's messing up my economy. The Chinese made that decision about oil and gas, decades before. That's why they have their whole program in clean tech. So if I can control clean tech inside my country, then I feel more secure. Once I put a solar panel up, it's there. Once I put a wind installation in, it's there. So there's still this sort of, what's happening in, critical minerals markets. That's still, a thing. But if I have supply chains and I can switch to this thing that I can control, I'm interested. So I personally think it helps clean tech. And indeed, on the flip side of that, and I've talked about this study in the past, and it's going to be one of those studies that every 3 or 4 years I'm going to say, oh, look at this study I did, So together with a scholar from Rice University, we looked at, is clean tech investment pro-cyclical to oil? In other words, when oil prices are up, do people invest more in clean tech startup companies and technologies and renewable projects or not? And the answer is yes. When oil prices are going up, people invest more. Countries do more R&D. Governments subsidize things more. The American oil companies, the big oil companies, the Exxon Mobils and the BPs and companies like that have extra revenue, and they use them to invest in new technologies and batteries and things like that, technologies. So if this turned out to be prolonged, I do think it's actually good for clean tech, and I think it's good for the environment, and I think that people might come away and say, oh, geez, I want to go towards clean tech. Now, the flip side is, let's say it's not as prolonged. I mean, could we do an optimistic scenario where there's actually peace in the Middle East? I mean, under a scenario where there's peace in the Middle East, I don't know, how many years would it take me to believe in that so that I stop investing in clean tech?
I agree, in fact, with the first point you were making, which is that just in terms of risk management, because we're in a position of uncertainty, we don't know what's going to happen to fossil fuel supplies and fossil fuel prices in the future. Diversifying away from them as much as possible in order to minimize your exposure looks even more compelling now than it did 2 weeks ago. I think that is very clear. If you think about Europe, which is now seeing its gas prices soar again for the second time in 4 years, the case for investing in renewables, in nuclear power, in more transmission to connect grids together, in demand response, VPPs, all those technologies we talk about a lot on this show, that case is becoming even more compelling now, I think, because of this. One way to view what we're seeing at the moment is it's a reminder of just how reliant the world is on fossil fuels, just how important they are. That's definitely true, and it shows how completely embedded they are in our economy and how we can't move away from them quickly. It's got to be a slow transition. But even so, it does also tell us that where you can make a transition, it's probably worth doing. And so I think that kind of competing impulse, and as you say, you talk about China, when you think about it, everything China's done in terms of developing its clean tech industry, investing so much in EVs, the way that EVs have soared as a share of China's vehicle market, all of those moves have been absolutely vindicated by what we're seeing right now in terms of the spike in oil prices.
And literally, BYD just this week announced some $9,000 vehicle that can charge in like 1/10 the time of, a Tesla.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, BYD's got its problems. It's absolutely not the case that everything about that Chinese industrial strategy has been perfect and brilliant. There have been some real problems with it along the line, and there's some real problems with it now. But it is still at least something which is cushioning the impact of this on China. And so, again, when you think about what Chinese policy is going to look like, I'm sure a redoubling of those efforts towards renewables and nuclear. So again, I think it is the case that just putting climate considerations entirely to one side, and obviously coal does nothing for the climate if you're going to burn more of it, but as I say, taking only an energy security perspective, the arguments for diversifying away from oil and gas are very much being underlined by what's happening at the moment.
And it's very interesting because, of course, you're right about the resurgence of coal. The interesting question will be for countries that are climate oriented, would this mean that, CCS for coal plants is going to find its moment? But I think the other thing is the Chinese new 5-year plan is starting to sort of, the details are starting to trickle out. And one of the high points, in fact, is that China's looking more at pumped hydro and other kinds of innovative storage off of the electricity system, and incorporating more integration of renewables in ways into their electricity system is coming out to be a bit of a priority on the energy side. So, that's kind of going to be an interesting development. And of course, once they come up with a solution that's working, they export that solution.
Absolutely. And then another industry that could really get a boost from this, I think, is green hydrogen. I was talking at the beginning of the show about how important the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz is for the global trade in urea for fertiliser. An alternative route to get that is by electrolyzing water, making green hydrogen, and turning that into ammonia and using that. That could be a viable source, particularly in areas that have low-cost production, like China, like India. And if conventional sources of fertilizer supply are disrupted, these new sources could come to be increasingly viable. So that's definitely another thing to watch, I think, is that green hydrogen value chain really rising towards commercial viability much more rapidly.
And I think that, Ed, to your point, it's not just that we had the disruptions of 2022 and have this coming so close along in time. There's also COVID, which disrupted all kinds of supply chains. So countries, again, maybe it's not efficient, and there's reasons why we trade globally to, lower costs and damp. There's reasons we trade globally to lower costs, to dampen down inflation, et cetera, et cetera. But when you have these crises, like even when they're temporary, they have a psychological impact, and it does really make politicians focus squarely on what can we do inside our own economy to control this.
So we are going to leave it there, but it's been fantastic talking to you both. Many thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Ed.
Many thanks, Chris.
Thanks for having me on, Ed.
It's been a great pleasure. Again, everyone check out Chris's podcast, The Last Dinosaur, wherever you get your podcasts. Hopefully we'll get you back on again to talk very soon, and we can follow the latest developments in what is obviously a very fast-moving story and still potentially big changes to come. Many thanks to our producers, Stuart Duffy, Toby Biggins-Gilchrist and Dan Cottrell. And above all, as ever, many thanks to all of you for listening. We really value your feedback. Please do keep that coming. And we'll be back very soon with all the latest news and views on the future of energy. Until then, goodbye.